and I want to try to point out to the Senate why this senator thinks, and a number of my colleagues join me, why that spike in gas prices is going up. There is further evidence that our energy markets are no longer governed just by the economic dictums of supply and demand when it comes to oil prices. And that's what I want to talk about. Now, it's simply this. The speculators are back. We saw the speculators in oil futures contracts. We saw their handiwork 2 years ago when the price of oil hit an all-time high of $147 a barrel. And this time, the speculators are seizing on the turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa to use that as an excuse to drive this price of oil sky high. And yet, recent upheavals abroad have had little, if any, effect on the actual supply of oil. Again, coming back to the economic theories of supply and demand. Libya, for example, controls only 2% of the world's oil supply. Well, Mr. President, there's a key piece of evidence that points the finger at these condo flippers of the commodities market. Data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, reveals that since January, when the protests began in Egypt, speculators have increased their betting on future oil price increases by more than 38%. And meanwhile, legitimate hedgers for oil futures contracts, legitimate hedgers like airlines and shipping companies and oil companies, have actually reduced their holdings in oil futures contracts. Now, for example, all you need to do is to see what's happening as represented on this chart. You see closely how the rise in oil prices, the red line, tracks the increase in speculative activity, the white line. A long position in a futures contract means that you're betting that the price of oil will go up, and therefore you buy a contract to buy oil at a determined amount in the future. That's what this chart is about. So if you go over here, on January the 25th of this year, the day that the protests began in Egypt, the speculative money was on long-held positions in just over 217,000 West Texas Intermediate crude oil futures contracts. West Texas Intermediate crude is the standard by which they judge. And when the protests began in Egypt, they were down at 217,000 futures contracts. Well, that's the equivalent of about 217 million barrels of oil. On March 8th, the last day for which we have the data, these same speculators held the equivalent of more than 301 million barrels of crude, which was an increase of 38%, from 217 to 301. Now, look how closely the price of oil tracks these swings. This is the speculative buying or betting in futures contracts, the white line. look how closely the price of oil follows, the red line. During the same period, from January the 25th to March the 8th, the price of oil climbed from $85 a barrel all the way up to $105 a barrel. That's an increase of nearly 24%. And guess who the loser is in this game of profit gouging? It's the American consumer. Higher gasoline prices mean less money for anything that the American consumer has to buy. And at the end of the day, guess who else is the big loser? It's the American economy. Well, because of this, last year when we passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, Congress empowered the Commodities Futures Trading Commission to rein in excessive speculation to keep the commodities markets from flying off the rails, just like it is in the last 2 months. And yet, the Commission, the CFTC, has yet to finalize new rules to govern the speculative position limits. And meantime, what happens is speculators continue to buy $100 worth of oil futures with just $6 down, 6% down to buy oil contracts for futures. And I believe that the law that we passed last year has given the CFTC an extremely effective tool at its disposal that it could use to discourage excessive energy speculation and bring down gas prices that our American consumers are now finding that are hurting their pocketbooks so much. And that authority is the authority to impose higher margin requirements on oil futures contracts. So instead of $6, they could require that there be more than 6% that they would have to pay down on buying a future oil contract. Now, in the current system, some ordinary investors have to put down as much as 50% in order to buy things, while financial speculators have to post only 6% to buy a future contract in oil. That doesn't seem to me to be fair and is leading to this kind of system of which there is now pain at the pump. Well, these kinds of margin requirements are not set by federal regulators, but rather by the exchanges themselves. And for the same reason that we don't let pharmaceutical companies approve of their own drugs, we shouldn't let futures exchanges self-regulate by setting their own margin requirements. Fortunately, in a section of the Dodd-Frank bill, Section 736, Congress removed the broad statutory restriction that prohibited the CFTC from setting those margin requirements. And that section authorizes the CFTC to call for higher margin requirements in order to protect the financial integrity so that this kind of thing doesn't happen. So, Mr. President, I'm calling on the CFTC now to exercise the authority that the Congress, signed into law by the President, gave them last July. I'm asking them to get going on this. There is a letter that has been circulated here among the senators encouraging the CFTC to use the Commission's power to increase margin requirements on these oil speculators. I want to urge my colleagues who are listening to join in this letter as it is circulated among your offices. And under the Dodd-Frank Act, These new margin requirements would take effect as soon as July, but the CFTC must begin the rulemaking process now. Because if we don't, and you get into the summer driving season, you know what's going to happen here. And this is March. It's just going to keep going up and up. Now, I want to be clear, where those who have a legitimate reason, like airlines, like shipping companies, like oil companies, to buy future contracts, that margin level would not apply to them. It would only apply to the speculators. Imposing a higher margin level on speculators, it's consistent with existing exchanges practices.